morning, everybody, and thank you, Emma, for the invitation. I'm really excited to be here tonight to present to you Leading with Emotional Intelligence. It's funny, because when I initially talked to Emma about the opportunity, I think it was mid-January. It was a pre-coronavirus world back then. And since then, we've seen stockpiling of toilet paper like it's gold bullion. We've seen, people developing plans and policies around this, almost on the fly, I suppose. We've certainly seen some fistfights in aisle 7 of Woolies stores as well. But the most important thing from my point of view is around what my clients are telling me at the moment. And most organisations are at the point of developing some sort of fluid policy and process around this. But what I'm hearing a lot is my people are anxious, they're uncertain, they're worried about what's going to go on. So to me, more than ever, emotional intelligence becomes really an important tool to support our people when they're feeling really uncertain about what's happening next and how does it affect me and how can I control my situation. And I guess the point is, at the moment, from a personal point of view, people don't feel like they're in control. But as leaders and as people in the OD, L&D and HR space, we can actually influence that. And tonight we'll talk a little bit about that. So I'm looking forward to sharing with you tonight how we create some value with emotional intelligence. And it's, from my point of view, really topical given where we're at this point in time in the corona era, if you like. So in this session, we'll do 3 things. We'll take a bit of a fresh take on emotional intelligence. So everybody's got a bit of an idea about what that is, but I'd really like to share you some of the latest neuroscience research on emotional intelligence and what it tells us about where we are now and where we're heading to. I'd also like to highlight, and this is the second one there, how it affects leaders and some examples where it's actually helped leaders rise to the top, but also where it's hindered leaders in terms of, the best way to describe it is implosion, I suppose. And then the last part of tonight, I'd like to give you just a couple of tips that you might be able to use tomorrow as part of building your own emotional intelligence muscle, if you like. So that is our plan for the next 40 minutes, let's just say. I'd like to start with a very simple question, and those of you on the podcast, feel free to play at home as well. I'd like you to take a few seconds just to think about how you feel right this very second. And I'd like you to think about that in just 1 or 2 words. And the reason being the 1 or 2 words is because it actually helps you get very focused on exactly how you're feeling. The good news is I'm not going to ask you to share that. That's always I can feel the emotions rise in the room as we say that. I'm not going to ask you to share, but we will come back to that because it's an important part of building that muscle that we talked about a little bit earlier. So do you have your 1 word? Great, I see 1 nod, and that's all I need to move on. So you might be wondering who I am and why I get the opportunity to spend some time with you tonight. Here's a photo of me and my 8 brothers and sisters, and I'm the 8th of 9 children. And I guess, I started learning about emotional intelligence from a very, very early age, and I feel like with 5 older brothers, I was pretty much on the back foot for probably the first 10 years of my life. And if you've got older brothers, you probably know exactly where I'm coming from. So things like stealing food off the plate at night, or even worse, and this is a true situation, I had a friend whose parents owned a cake shop, and my older brothers would bully me into going to play with this poor girl because they knew at the end of the day I'd be sent home with cakes because the people who have 9 in the family clearly need to be fed more. So for the first 10 years, I feel like I was on the back foot, and then something switched around about the age of 10, and I figured out that I needed to make some allies of some of these brothers and sisters if I needed to get my way, and I figured out I needed to do a little bit of leveraging to influence them. So all went swimmingly until I got my first real job after uni at 22 with Woolworths, and essentially that was a completely different ball game for me in terms of reading the mood of individuals that I'd never met before, of understanding the politics of the organisation, of figuring out who's who in the zoo. And it became quite clear, quite quickly for me, that it wasn't just about this juggernaut of an organisation that had heaps of policies and procedures that made the world spin, but the relationships. It's about how you influence people and how you build rapport and build trust so that you can pull on those relationships to get favours done and vice versa. I see nods around the room. I think you have all been there as well. So after 17 years there, and I primarily was in HR and L&D roles, I'd seen probably the best and worst of expressions of emotions from leaders. Some leaders in the moment bubbled to the top through their the way in which they could express themselves emotionally and how they can convert that into rallying the troops and engaging people and mobilising them and getting outcomes. And others in the moment exploded or imploded, if you like, in terms of their emotional outbursts. And they're the ones we used to like to call white-collar psychopaths. You'd be probably familiar with a few of those in your time. And the reason I say in the moment is a really important part of emotional intelligence, because it's not about what you do post the moment. The real strength of emotional intelligence is how you can actually control and master those emotions in the moment, and that's what makes the difference in terms of building your muscle. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through. In 2008, I started my own business, Ignite Performance, and primarily I was there to help my clients support them in terms of building performance, getting outcomes, and primarily using leadership skills to do that. But about 5 years ago, I became a social and emotional accredited coach. And it really did change my world. I always thought I was pretty emotionally intelligent, but I learnt a lot more about me and how I respond to situations, and particularly respond in the moment, that I could then use to help my clients. And so it's been a really interesting journey for me, and one that I wouldn't give up for quids. So when Em talked to me about the fact that this was all about purpose, I feel like this is my purpose, to help others and help myself, because I'm a work in progress, build emotional intelligence in order to create better performing workplaces. To start the night, what I'd really like to do is to share with you my own little version of the iceberg model. You'd all be familiar with that. I've converted that, and for those of you playing on the podcast at home, what I've got in front of here is a picture of a tree that has underneath the surface enormous roots. And to me, this is a really good reflection of what is emotional intelligence. You know, we see underneath the surface, or in fact we don't see, but we can see on the screen, but underneath the surface there's a lot of things that happen emotionally at any given time. And you may not be aware that whenever you have an experience happen to you on a daily basis, the first region of the brain it hits is your emotional brain. Do you know how many emotions we would experience on average a day? Throw me a number.
Isn't it 9,000? Something crazy like that?
A little less than that.
I was thinking 100, but you know,
Yeah.
when you said that, I was like,
Oh, no, that was thoughts, sorry.
Thoughts, yeah, that sounds about right, about thoughts, yeah. About 400 emotions on average. Of course, some days are worse than others, and we've all experienced those, and some are better than others. But yet, we do experience around 400 emotions a day. What happens next is we obviously have thoughts and then behaviours, and we can go one of two ways. And on the right-hand side of that tree, you can see there's two sort of avenues we can go with those emotions. One is around, you know, if we've got thoughts of what feelings of being worried or uncertain, that might lead to being problem-focused, reactive and defensive in our thoughts and our behaviour. Or you can also be action biased and take control and engage others to help you get results. The difference between your response and the emotions you have is emotional intelligence. And to me, that's the mastering of the data between your emotional brain and your rational brain. If you can imagine a seesaw of emotion brain and a rational brain, you can imagine that every day, your poor brain is doing its best to keep things in balance. But sometimes with low emotional intelligence, the emotional brain wins out. And so it's a really important graph, I guess, this one, because it gives us a nice metaphor for what happens on a daily basis and how we're kind of struggling to get that right harnessing of emotion to enable us to make the right decisions and to do the right actions as we go along. So a little visual for you to round that out. On the screen here for podcasters at home, we've got a picture of some shiny apples and one is cut in half. It's a really nice, cool fact about emotional intelligence that it can actually help you predict in advance exactly how you're going to feel. So if I can give you an example, I've got a picture of an apple. I want you to imagine now that you're about to bite into that apple. And in doing so, you can see the colour of it, you can smell the sweetness of it, you can imagine the crunch, you can hear the crunch of it, and then finally the tangy taste of it all. And essentially what happens at that point in time is that your neurons start working to help you out here. So they're releasing enzymes ready to dissolve the sugar that's happening. They're going to help you produce saliva so that you're getting ready to swallow it. And I wouldn't be surprised if if you haven't eaten too much of the cheese tonight, you might be feeling like, I'm a bit hungry now that we started talking about crispy apples. Well, here's the thing, there's no physical apple right here in the room, but who's had the sensation of imagining eating that apple right now? For the podcasters at home, there was a couple of hands in the air. In fact, everything that we just talked about happened in a very split second. And the thing about that is we have had experiences in the past, plenty of them, of eating apples, and so we can predict what that's going to be like. If we relate this to emotional intelligence and to the workplace, every time you have an experience at work where you have had a similar experience in the past, we're actually trying to predict what happens next. Sometimes that works for us, and sometimes that works against us. And I'm sure you're probably thinking, your brain's probably alive with thoughts about where it's worked and where it hasn't for you in the past. So that's a really cool fact about emotional intelligence, that it's not just about mastering the data, but it's also about our ability to predict what's going to happen next. Can I share with you a couple of fresh facts about emotional intelligence that you may not be aware of? Our brain has just one purpose in life. Do you know what it is? Exactly. Its job is to keep us alive. And what it does for every moment of every day is it scans the environment, it scans the experiences you have, and it says, is this dangerous or is it helpful? Is it dangerous or is it helpful? And of course, you know now that every experience we have firstly happens in the emotional brain before it happens in the rational brain. And so essentially what happens next is that emotions, which are chemicals essentially, like cortisol and adrenaline, are constantly being released in response to our perceptions of the experiences that we're having. So the really important part about that is we might feel sad or feel anxious or feel nervous, but in fact that is not a negative emotion for us. That is about our body saying, all right, it's time to rally, it's time for us to survive, we need to thrive here. If there's no threat to your emotional brain, the amygdala says, okay, at ease, rational brain, time for you to take over. But if there is a perceived threat, and I say perceived deliberately because this isn't what is it, but what is it in my experience? If there's a perceived threat from your brain, then it essentially paralyzes your rational brain and it says, you won't be needed at the moment, I'm going to take over. And we'll work out what happens next. And so your emotional brain is the one that actually predicts the next behaviour from you. People with high emotional intelligence use this idea of bad emotions, which there isn't, but emotions that usually are seen as bad, but use those to their benefit, to their advantage at work, because it enables them to get really focused and and pay attention to what's really important, and get angry and mobilize others to help them. But there are people out there that don't have that emotional intelligence. I mean, how many hours training, for instance, at school did you get on emotional intelligence? And that would be a big fat none. So there are plenty of people out there in their defence that have had very little emotional intelligence training. And what happens then is we get fisticuffs in aisle 7 of Chullora Woolies. And for the podcasters, there's a picture, and you can Google it, of people fighting over toilet paper in aisle 7 of the Woolies. And if we take this experience, it's a really interesting one. You know, since the virus has been announced, I've been watching with interest the reactions of people, and it's been very interesting, because if we think that your brain takes an experience and the first thing it does is says, what is this like in my past experience? What is our brain telling us about coronavirus in the most instances? We don't have. Yeah, we don't have this experience. Yeah, we're navigating into the unknown, and it's a scary place for a lot of people. And I think what happened here is that people are trying to find a way in which they can take some control, and doing something, even if it's hoarding toilet paper, doing something is better than doing nothing. But of course, when they decide on that action and somebody comes in and tries to undermine that action, they feel even more threatened by that. And of course, their amygdala goes on high alert, and it creates that fear and uncertainty, and they kind of lose perspective. They kind of lose that ability to be rational about the situation. You know, there is something those ladies could have done in aisle 7 that way to take back a little bit of control. And later on, I'm going to share with you what that might be. So if you're an innocent bystander later on tonight, somewhere in Woolies, picking up something on the way home, and you see something, you might be able to step in and help create some calm in the situation. So, interesting fact number 1 about emotional intelligence: all emotions have positive purpose, even the ones that seem scary and fearful. Interesting fact number 2, emotional intelligence doesn't necessarily mean emotional competence. And what do I mean by that? Imagine emotional intelligence as a muscle that you are born with. Everybody has a quotient. That's the good news. We're all born with some emotional intelligence. Imagine that you start moving through life, you start doing activities, you start, playing a bit of sport, and you're building that muscle as you go through. Similarly, as we start interacting with people, as we start navigating situations in the world, we do build a quotient of emotional intelligence. But what if you're expected to be a high performer in a competitive environment under pressure on a regular basis, and you don't know when that's going to happen? I see Alan nodding and smiling here, because he's saying that's kind of what I have to do and deal with all day long. And that's a really important point, because unless you're actually actively building that emotional intelligence muscle tone on a regular basis, you are kind of holding onto the raft in the white water, hoping for the best without a paddle. There are things that we can do to help us in this situation to take a bit more control around emotional intelligence. One is to apply, and this is where we start talking about emotional competence, which is different. So if I give an example, and I was talking to Nathan a little bit earlier, who is involved in driving customer service. I might have a quotient of empathy as part of my emotional intelligence, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I have the ability to translate that empathy into superior customer service. I could serve somebody, but does that mean that I know what is expected from me and can channel that empathy to provide superior customer service? So there's a very big difference between having the base amount of intelligence and being able to apply that to create competence in the workplace. We see that a lot in, and on the right-hand side, as you can see on that screen there, and for the podcasters at home, it's the typical 4-quadrant model that you see with emotional intelligence that talks about self-awareness, being able to regulate your emotions, having empathy for others, and that includes social awareness, and being able to influence others and build relationships as part of it. So there are actually 26 competencies, and for me, I talked a little bit on the introduction about, you know, sometimes I had a bit of skepticism about emotional intelligence because I thought at some stage, you know, is this just about managing the emotions? No, it's actually about converting those emotions into driving those skills like conflict management, skills like political awareness, skills like bias for action. So when we talk about the 26 competencies, you can have a quotient of emotional competence in some areas, but not others. And if I can give you a really good example from some of the work I do with some of my clients, I've got a manager who's very self-aware and can regulate his emotions. But if we talk about what's happening with Bob in the workplace, because Bob just announced that he's leaving, he wouldn't have a clue what happened to Bob. He would say, well, hang on, I spoke to Bob yesterday and I thought everything was all right. And yet you're telling me now that Bob's leaving? And somebody else says, well, Bob's been unhappy for a really long time. Did you not know? No, I didn't. So we call that the meerkat effect, by the way. That's the ability to look up from your work, scan the environment, see what's going on from reading the mood, finger on the pulse, get the lay of the land, and then get back to your work. It's a really important skill as part of being an emotionally intelligent leader within an organisation. So that's one example. Another example, if I can give you, a friend of mine, an HR manager, started in a new role, and she was with the leader of the organisation in multiple meetings, and she noticed that in every single meeting he berated, just picked out one person and berated them publicly. So really unnecessary, but made a point, made a big deal of it, and moved on. She plucked up the courage after seeing this twice and said to him, can I ask, why are you doing this to these people? What's going on? And he said, I know I do it, but I probably shouldn't, should I? So there's somebody, if we talk about the left-hand side, the self-awareness, there's somebody who has awareness of their emotions and their effect on others, but is choosing not to regulate that, or maybe doesn't know how. Who knows? I haven't coached them, so I'm not sure what's really going on underneath the surface. But there's plenty of opportunities, I think, from our point of view when we talk about emotional intelligence to really get into the guts of how do we actually convert this into skills that help support people to perform better, to lead better, and to help the organisation ultimately achieve its goals. So there are my two hot tips, or hot facts, if you like, around emotional intelligence. Let's talk about how this applies then in a leadership style. And I've got a story to tell you, I've got two stories to tell you. The tale of two leaders. And one is about, in leadership we have high emotional intelligence which can lead to control and being able to predict what's going to happen and focus. And the other one is low emotional intelligence that has led to a complete and utter breakdown for this particular person in their behaviour, and it's instantaneous, but it has damaging consequences. So let's start with the positive, shall we? I don't want to bring it down too much tonight. Who's ever seen the movie Sully?
No, Sully's Story.
Sully's Story, great, excellent. It's a brilliant movie too, by the way. So this is the story of a guy called Chesley Sullenberger. He's a pilot. And he had been flying planes for 40 years, and he took off for a routine flight from JFK in 2009, and within minutes of taking off, all of a sudden a flock of geese, of all things, flew into not one but two engines, and he lost the ability to fly the plane instantaneously. Now, Sally had 208 seconds from that moment to saving lives or not, one or the other, 208 seconds. I think that's a really important number because to me, that's a really good number of what happens in our brain, generally speaking, and how long we've got to make decisions that are going to either help us or hinder us at the end of the day. But anyway, back to Sally. He says, in that first moment that the geese hit, he could feel in his body, he says it was a sickening pit of the stomach, falling through the floor feeling. That's the first thing that happens because we know that every experience that happens to you happens in the emotional brain first. But here's where the seesaw comes in for someone as experienced as Captain Sully. Essentially what happened next was that he was able to acknowledge that feeling and then control his thoughts to be focused on the decision at hand. What am I going to do next to save these 155 lives on board that are going to make the difference? And good news story, I hope I'm not spoiling a spoiler for you if you plan on watching it and didn't know, but of course they land in the Hudson after 208 seconds and every one of those 155 people were saved and they got out. Now, for a while there, Sully was thought to be, is this the right decision? Ultimately, they have claimed him as a hero, but for me, he's a hero because he is the epitome of what happens when you have high emotional intelligence and are able to use that to control the data between your emotional and your rational brain and be able to make the right decisions through self-awareness, regulation of emotion, and being able to control that to say, what's the next decision? So it created this opportunity for him to be really focused on the right decision for that right moment. So it's a really good example of emotional intelligence in a leader in action that had good results. By the by, you may not have caught up in the news today, but it's highly ironic that Tom Hanks and his poor wife have actually been proclaimed that they have coronavirus, so I hope everything's okay, but what a weird coincidence that is. So that's the story of Sully as a really good example of how emotional intelligence can help a leader in the moment become a hero in that instance. But what happens when emotional intelligence isn't your friend in the moment? And for this, and there'll be good reason why you'll know why I've done the no name, no background policy for this one. Here's an example of a stressed out senior leader who got off the phone. Here's the context. He got off the phone from speaking to someone who reports into one of his direct reports. So two people down from him, but they're having a conversation and he heard something that he wasn't happy with as part of that conversation. And so in those 208 seconds after he got off the phone, he decided to write an email to his direct reports. And the email went like this. Where are we today? My expectation, a cohesive team. We are not at the moment, and today we draw a line in the sand and move on. So far, so good. Any cancer will be cut out. I cannot and will not allow people in my team who are not team players. Lies will not be tolerated. People who make up stories and try to gain support by deception will be sacked. Last but definitely not least, do not tell lies. I will sack you when I catch you. That is a fact. This job is not hard. If you cannot do it, don't let me make the call for you. I must have absolute trust in my team. Now, I have to tell you, that was about 4 more paragraphs long, and I've sort of cut it down and I've changed it a little bit to keep people from an anonymity point of view. But here is the very essence of what we would call an amygdala hijack. Something's happened in terms of that person's experience. It's gone to his emotional brain. He's felt under threat by what he has heard, and rather than take a moment to process that, to control that, to balance the seesaw in favour of the rational brain, he shut down that rational brain, and his emotional brain has made the next decision for him, which was penning an email in 208 seconds to all and sundry. Now tell me, if you were his direct report receiving that email, how would you feel?
Belittled at least, because saying how
Yeah. So belittled and feeling unmotivated by that, probably a little bit disengaged as well. And in fact, that's exactly what happened with this particular team. It kind of, if they had trust with that particular manager, it kind of breached that trust. That particular manager wasn't a bad manager, but had a bad moment that had an impact, a sort of a lasting impact on that person, or on the team as a result. So it's a very good example of emotional intelligence not in action in this instance, and how it can have, career limitations, I guess, or elevate you as the hero of the day. You know, I help managers every single day with these kind of complex, challenging situations, but not once do they talk about emotional intelligence. And I think from our point of view as coaches of leaders and of leaders ourselves, it's important to understand or listen out for the words that are being used, but understanding what's really being said is, we've got some emotional intelligent challenges here. And if I can give you a couple of quick examples, a leader, I'm not coaching him, but he's a person that I know pretty well, was telling me the other day that he has 2 of his senior leaders coming to his office on a regular basis to complain about one another, and that he feels like he's a little bit of the umpire, a little bit of dad, that he's kind of got to play the sides. And the other day he just lost the plot and said, go out, sort it yourself, I don't want to hear from you, you work it out, you don't even come back, just don't come back at all. But the thing is, and we're talking about the 4 quadrants, there's a lot going on there. There's a lack of self-awareness of the individuals. There's a lack of ability to regulate their emotions. They definitely have no empathy for one another. And of course, it's not only damaging that relationship, it's damaging the relationship that they have with their leader, who's now seeing them as the kids that can't sort out their own problems. But it's having a ripple effect, on a cascade effect, if you like, on the people that report into them, who's saying, well, what side should I be on? Are they're fighting at the moment? Am I allowed to go and talk to them? This has got organisational impacts when people are showing, a lack of emotional intelligence. So there's plenty of examples that I see every day in the work that I do with clients where emotional intelligence is lacking, and I'm sure that you see the same. So what can we do, I suppose, to help boost our own emotional intelligence? Well, I've got a couple of hot tips for you, and I call the first one the warm-up before the workout. And that's the reason why is because we do this in the calm of the moment, we don't do this in the heat of the moment. So it's a way that you can build this emotional intelligence muscle any time of the day that will help you in the moment. And let me give you an example. This idea of naming it to tame it, sorry, I didn't come up with that, but I think it's pretty clever. But essentially what it is it's labeling the emotion that you're having. So remember when I said to you at the beginning of the session, how are you feeling right now? That is a deliberate effect of building your emotional literacy, if you like. And we know from a neuroscience point of view that the better you get at clarifying the name of how you're feeling, so labeling the name of those 400 emotions that you have each day, the more likely that in the moment you'll be able to regulate that emotion, because you're kind of getting very aware about how you're feeling. So it's essentially being in tune with how you're feeling. So my suggestion, my hot tip for you is during a day, just take a couple of moments every now and then to say, how am I feeling right this very second? Another hot tip before we move on from this, try and get nuanced about that. And by that I mean not just happy, I'm feeling happy right now, but perhaps it might be that you're feeling surprised or joyous or elated. So try and get nuanced about what that means, so you're getting much more clearer, I guess, about what that emotion means. We know there's thousands of emotions that you can have. So making it more specific will certainly help you open the door to emotional intelligence. Very simple one to build that muscle. And hot tip number 2, Still in the warm-up phase. Remember, we're not under pressure at the moment. Know your own triggers. You know, I went to my niece's wedding recently and my brother got up and he said, by 16, my daughter Jess knew every single one of my hot buttons. She knew which ones to press, she knew when, and she exercised that opportunity on a regular basis. You know, it doesn't have to be like that, and feeling like you're under attack is a terrible way to be. So knowing in the calm of the moment what gets you in that state is really important for you to be able to control that. And what that will be for me will be very different for each one of you. So what might you do if you know that, for instance, in the moment you hate being challenged because it feels like it's you know, a challenge on your personal integrity, or you don't like what you consider or perceive to be unfair behaviour, as an example. So know what that trigger is, and then start working on, well, what does that mean for me? How do I actually respond to that? What do I feel in the moment? How does it exhibit in my body? Do I get that pit of the stomach feeling? Do I get hot around the neck? Do I get tight shoulders? So understanding how it physically demonstrates. And then what is the self-talk? What are you telling yourself about that is perhaps not true, but feels very true in the moment because it's your emotional brain taking over your thinking? Having those conversations with yourself and being really aware about what your hot triggers are in the calm of the moment means that when you're in the heat of the moment, there is that space to pause and say, I know what this is, I've been thinking about it, I understand how it's exhibiting in my body, and I think I can control that, because we know emotional intelligence is all about controlling the data between the emotional and the rational brain. So that's hot tip number 2. Hot tip number 3, and this is, of course, in the workout phase. So you're actually in the heat of the moment in the battle, and this is a pretty simple one. It's a really good one for the ladies in aisle 7 at Woolies, actually, and for anyone else that feels like they're talking to people who have that fear around corona. So, and this is simply about changing the focus. So what I really liked, let's just go to the ladies in aisle 7. I don't know if you actually watched that video, but at the end of it, you might have noticed that somebody came in and separated those people. That's all you need as a starting point to give people space to change their focus onto something else. So it's now not about the 6-pack of toilet paper, it's about what happens next. And that's a really important point. The coronavirus and this feeling of anxiety and concern, if you're talking to somebody at work tomorrow or talking to leaders who say, I don't know how I can actually help people, one really good way is to get people future focused. So get them to say, if we're thinking about a year from now and we're thinking about how you responded or how you would like to have responded, what would that look like for you? How would you like to say that you behaved in this particular time? So pushing people out of their present gets them away from the immediate threat, gets them thinking about a better time down the track, and enables them to look back on that time, gives them again space. But what if it's you that's in the heat of the moment and you're not sure what to do? What's the best way for you to create a sense of calm that is all about changing your focus? So imagine you're in a meeting and somebody's just said to you something that's really got your goat and you're really unhappy with it. A really good way of giving you some space to get the seesaw back into balance, into the rational, is to give yourself 5 seconds to leave if you can, go and grab a drink of water and then come back. But what if you can't leave? What if it's impossible to leave? Focus on something in the room that you don't normally focus on. And just by simply doing that, it'll give you something different to do. Your neurons will be firing, checking out this new thing, and that will allow your rational brain to take some control back. In this picture on the screen, what do you see? For the record, people have said a distracted child. When we change our focus for that, you might see something different. In this picture, what do we now see? we see a person with their head upside down on the floor behind the distracted child. Let me just go back to picture 1, distracted child, and picture 2, some person much more distracted than that child because they've decided to check out from the world and they're actually kind of doing a headstand, I suppose. Change your focus and you'll see things differently to perhaps what you see today. And so I was only going to do 3 tips, but I've got a bonus 4th one for you, and at the risk of sounding like your mother, get some sleep. Get enough sleep, whatever that might mean for you, because all the neuroscience shows us is that when you have enough sleep, you are in a better position to regulate your emotions, especially if you're feeling under threat. So easier said than done, that's another story, but that's a really important one in terms of preventing feeling like you're under threat or under attack. So I'd like to finish off with just 2 slides. One is around just some books that I love on emotional intelligence, and this is around Your Brain at Work by David Rock, Daniel Goleman, the godfather of emotional intelligence, Emotional Intelligence by a lady called Jill Hassan, and The Heart of Leadership by Joshua Friedman. I don't know if you've done a lot of research on emotional intelligence, but essentially we know from people like the Deloitte's Access Economics report that 2/3 of all knowledge workers by 2030 will need emotional intelligence as their step in the door skill. You might have heard that old saying, IQ gets you in the door, EQ gets you promoted. Well, in 10 years' time, EQ will get you in the door. You will need this skill as a base skill. It won't be a added on, cream of the crop skill. Everybody will need that. And there's another really interesting piece of research from the World Economic Forum that says, in terms of the top 10 skills of the future, one of them is emotional intelligence. And when they talked about skills of the future, it was in 2018, and they were talking about 2022. So we're not that far off in terms of this being a really important skill to cultivate. Can I finish with a quote? And then I'd be pleased to take some questions from you. One of my favourites, Viktor Frankl. You guys may or may not know about Viktor, but essentially he was a prisoner of war, Jewish prisoner of war in a Nazi concentration camp. He was a neuroscientist, he was a psychologist, and essentially he said, if I'm going to survive here, they might have control over my environment, they might have control over my body, but they're not going to have control over my will and my thinking. And so he made that decision right then to be able to remove himself. And he said this is the famous quote, between stimulus and response, there is space, and in that space lies our freedom and power to choose our response. And in our response lies our growth and our freedom. And the reason I chose that particular quote, and by the way, he went on to survive and thrive as a psychologist, but the reason I chose that quote is because to me, emotional intelligence isn't the silver bullet. It's not all that a leader needs to be successful, but for me, it offers the best opportunity for growth and for freedom and to be the best version of ourselves. And at the end of the day, what more could we ask for when we think about our purpose but to be the best version of ourselves? So to finish off, I just want to ask you one question to get your neurons firing, and that is, what are you wondering right now about emotional intelligence? Let me help you. Thank you.